My name is Manuel Johnson, and I've been involved in social movements in Quebec for about the last 14 years as well. Housing, healthcare, and currently questions about access to justice, because I work in a community legal clinic in Point St. Charles.
My name is John Bradley, and for the past 35 years I've been involved in a number of community organizations and social movements, mostly around questions of health, urban health, and nonprofit housing, and more recently with the whole question of popular education, whether around the economy and the question of social justice and ecological crises.
I know that you grew up in Verdun. Can you tell me what kind of neighborhood Verdun is now and what kind of neighborhood it was when you were growing up in?
I think then you probably had maybe 40%, which was English speaking, 60% Francophone. But as in many communities, the percentage of Anglophones reduced for a whole series of reasons. Okay. One of the key ones is the economic boom in Toronto and in Vancouver and in the West. A whole series of other questions, cultural questions, but so it becomes more and more francophone. But it was working class, okay. And it's difficult to say, that level of consciousness of working class. If I talk to a friend of mine like David Fenario, and I think this, in some ways, this is a history that gets lost. Mm-hmm. Was there a strong, say in the 30s, a strong working class movement against evictions and unionization? I look at Norman Bethune comes to Verdun, almost a public health clinic in the 30s. Does that resonate throughout the community? Mm-hmm. It's hard to tell. That's almost a history that gets erased. So I think to some degree, and here I refer again to David Fenario, the playwright, is to sort of try and rethink and rediscover part of that continuity. Strong class consciousness, working class. I'm guessing I didn't see it in a general sense in Verdun during that period of time.
Growing up in Verdun in the 60s, what kind of social movements did you observe and how did that influence you?
Right. I think what happens, and this would be in sort of the mid-60s for me, mid-60s, late 60s, there's this whole phenomenon, and it relates to that sort of awakening, if one wants to call it, both, say, culturally, politically in Quebec, right, in terms of La Révolution Tranquille, that has a lot of elements, including a left element to it. Mm. You combine that with, say, sort of anti-Vietnam and this whole student movement that occurs in the 60s, which also occurs at McGill, mm-hmm. where I am. Mm-hmm. And that becomes both a personal and political thing. I like to think of it in terms of Herbert Ames, a Montreal historian, wrote a book in the 1890s called The City Below the Hill, mm-hmm. Which talks about the Point and Saint-Marie. Okay. So, and this is a phenomenon that occurs throughout North America. And one could even trace sort of to a 19th century in Europe, where the child comes from the country and comes to the city. This is the Bildungsroman that you would look at Stendhal or Balzac, and then tries to make their way uptown, okay. Right? So there's always this play between downtown, say, liberal education, radical, and being from a working class down the hill. Mm-hmm. I won't go into the reason why it's always down the hill or towards the east, but that's another matter. Okay. So there's that. One sees it. And then people from up the hill, whether it's architects, whether it's social workers, or whether it's doctors, mm-hmm. in a case if I take the clinic, they come down the hill and they try and work with people in neighborhoods around various questions, poverty. I guess my first exposure to that was within this whole Greater Montreal Anti-Poverty coordinating committees that had groups throughout the area, and in Verdun it was called VAPA, Verdun Anti-Poverty Association, where we looked at questions of welfare, we looked at questions of legal rights. It was I would say it was run by people from the neighborhood, contacts with the sort of the larger groups throughout Montreal, and I was involved in it, peripherally. Where there were a number of people. Sometimes we were looking at questions of pollution and other items like that. It didn't. I don't remember. One would have to look at the history of it. I don't think it persisted for more than 6 or 7 years, mm-hmm. And but that was one of the ones in Verdun that I remember. And then it was a number of years later, say after McGill, and so I was away from Montreal, and then coming back, and then it became more a question around health questions for me, urban questions, in housing, in nonprofit housing, which was the community, the Milton Park community, where I really began to sort of open up and make contacts and become part of this kind of network, especially around housing advocacy.
You also mentioned this dynamic of uptown and downtown, people coming down the hill, and you mentioned it, you talked about the clinic, but tell me more about that.
Yeah, no, I think, it's an interesting one, and people have, my memory comes to, I can't remember the exact title of it, but a book that was written by Anna Krasinski, who teaches over here at Concordia, but also lives in The Point, around that whole period. I can't remember the name, I think it's called Patchwork or something, but it's an oral history, especially with the women in The Point, which looks at those kinds of questions. Okay. But I think what you have there is you have, and this comes out of the 60s and community organizing, which has its, on the one hand, it's sort of its origins in states with people like Alinsky. You have Eric Schrag, who's well known in Montreal around these questions, coming back from, I think he was at Michigan State or University of Michigan. And that whole community organizing side. And then on the Francophone side, you have a whole other history of it, which is not necessarily that style of community organizing, but may be best exemplified by sort of a radical priest. If one looks at Jacques Couture, who ran for the MCM, the first, as the mayor, comes out of a sort of a radical workers priest phenomenon. Okay. Sort of akin to liberation theology. So you get these kind of left currents occurring, and there it becomes, if we're going to look at those questions of domination, then one's not going to be doing them, one's not going to be sort of playing them out in the field in high income areas. You're going to be in lower income areas. And I think in The Point, if I look at my experience in The Point in Verdun, it also becomes receptive because there's a sizable Anglophone population. So there's sort of a tie, and it ain't far from Concordia and McGill to walk down the hill to The Point. Right. The same thing occurs, I would say on the Francophone side, in terms of that university and that whole uphill, downhill, okay. Say in Saint-Henri or Nachalega-Maisonneuve or Centre-Sud. You have similar phenomena. Mm-hmm. And then you also have a strong, among some groups, a strong Marxist analysis, which sometimes, from my reading of it, I wasn't involved in it, but from talking to people, at some points there were some kinds of conflicts in terms of how do organizations and how do social movements at local levels, how do they proceed, right? Because there's a whole series of façons de faire, depending on at some points which tendency you would belong to. But the up the hill, down the hill then becomes what happens with the young people who are down the hill, then get a university education. And I think this is not a new phenomenon. I know quite a number of people in that situation. Fenario being one of them, a lot of my friends being one of them, is that on the one hand, you're sort of pulled towards this radical analysis, both poetic and political, up the hill, but you are also living and have an experience of a working class life and a working class background, working class concerns, etc. And that's been a constant for me, right? That sort of, it becomes complicated. Most of the time it's a positive. At other points it becomes not necessarily a negative, but a question.
Take the clinic as an example again. That was founded more or less 69, 70?
Yeah.
And why did these radicals coming down from the hill, and why did the people in the neighborhood who, if I understand it correctly, did kind of get on board, why did they decide that they needed to have a health clinic? Well, right. And that didn't have the same form as whatever other
right.
kind of health clinics existed at the time?
Right.
Why did they, what provoked that?
Yeah, well, let's be clear. In healthcare, public healthcare is a fairly recent phenomenon in Quebec and in Canada. It begins in 1944 in Saskatchewan. Okay. In Quebec, hospitalization is covered in the early 60s, but doctor's fees, I remember my mother, saying to the doctor who comes to the house, I'll have to pay you next week. I can't pay you today. Okay. So doctor's fees are only covered in the late 60s. Okay. So at the clinic, there's, still in terms of access, it really becomes a question of, are you going to have access or not? So it's out of that. And there's a few other clinics of that nature. I remember that there was one not far from here. It was over on Saint Famille, a local health clinic. There was one in Saint Jacques. There was one in Saint Henri. Then, with the whole question of the Quiet Revolution and in Quebec Inc., both business-wise, but also in terms of a society and a bureaucracy, growing. Then there's the creation of CLSCs at that point. The clinic, and I think the people in the clinic highly, really support the establishment of this health clinic because it's going to give them access to basic health care, right? And on top of that, you're going to have a say in how that's going to be done, right? So that makes a big difference. And at that point, when it becomes much more of a paragovernmental effort, the people in the neighborhood, and I think that's from the resistance of it, and for people who are interested, there's an interesting video on the clinic's website, which talks about the origins of it. It's a 30-minute video. There's one in English and one in French. Talks about that and the people who were there at the beginning. So I think in that sense, both the democracy side of it, people were involved in it, whatever the tensions may have occurred, people were quite involved with it at the beginning. There was an esprit d'ouverture from the people coming, although there may have been kind of tensions around the certain lines of certain parties at some point, but there was an esprit d'ouverture, and people became involved in it. The clinic, being a non-profit, independent, democratically run place, it may not have a direct impact on the health of the people in the neighborhood because there's a whole series of other determinants. But what it does, it allows a major health player to take public stands, political public stands, and I think that's a key element of the clinic, and is important when one looks at the notion of democratically, autonomously run community organizations.
Okay, how does that work? When you say people have a say in, and there's some kind of democratic control, how does that work?
At the clinic, the board is elected by the General Assembly, which is essentially made up of the residents and users of the services. Every year, the board is elected, and I think that there's one representative of the employees. Everyone else are citizens in the neighborhood. And so they can set the orientations. I mean, the budget is the same as the CLSC, but they can set the orientations of what the clinic's going to do, where they're going to put their efforts. And also, and I think that's important, in terms of those orientations, the clinic puts an emphasis upon the whole question of social determinants. They're very clear that we are just not a curative or I have to stop speaking in the present tense about the clinic. It's not a curative interventionist. I mean, that has to occur. Right. People have to be dealt with for their broken legs and for their chronic illnesses, of which they are, much too many in that area. The example that comes to mind is that if you compare the richest areas in Montreal and the Point, the life expectancy difference is 8 years, to the detriment of people living in the neighborhood, which always shocks and angers me. In that it's a theft of life. So those are the realities that people were dealing with in the late 60s, early 70s, and that we continue to deal with. So there's not only do the voices of people get heard in the clinic, they can be, to some degree, within certain parameters in terms of what's going on, they can be the decisive voice in terms of where the clinic goes. I don't want to over romanticize it because there are to some degree limits sometimes that are self-imposed for various reasons, but also limits that we still live in a society where what I talked about the 8-year difference. There's an 11-year difference in life expectancy without major disability.
Why did this model, why was it attractive, or what,
well, I think it was attractive for various reasons. I think that it's, one would sort of have to look at it, and people have written on the history of the clinic. What comes to mind is that you're in a period of certain ferment in the late 60s, right? There are a lot of things going on. It's you have a national left movement in Quebec, which is strong, say among the Francophones, although the Anglophones played a serious role at the beginning of the clinic. You have the whole notion of community organizing, which is there. It's sort of, there's something of a new day, right, that's occurring. And I think that's what's happening there. And then there, as I mentioned before, there's a real question of people don't have access to decent health care, right, as of even of the late 60s. the government looks at it and whatever gloss one wants to put at it, whether it's part of the economic boom and those surpluses become available and there's pressure from community organizations or union organizations to expand the welfare services of the state within this Keynesian model. We do have the money to do it. So there's a whole series of things going on, but it also becomes even within those contexts, you have very powerful lobby vis-a-vis the doctors. I was talking to a lawyer the other day, how they fought tooth and nail around various questions. One can look back to 1944 in Saskatchewan, where they go on strike when Medicare comes in. Okay. You look here, and there's always that pressure, and that pressure continues today from the medical establishment, is that you do not want a state-run system, this whole notion of the professionalization of the medical of doctors, very powerful lobby. All we have to do is look at our, let's say, in quotes, our friend who is now the Minister of Health in
That's
Quebec.
A nice way of putting it.
Yeah.
Talking about urban health and housing. At this period, if you look at the clinic, or if you look at Milton Park, and the whole social housing, before 1970, let's say, social housing was not a reality in Quebec either. So what were you doing that made it work, that made it have that kind of impact?
There were some social housing projects before. They're fairly isolated, like the Jean Mance project. Okay. It was 1959. And there was a number of projects in the early 70s, but they're sort of here and there. And that occurred in the Point with a group called, there were several groups, but this was a group called Conseil de Développement d'Habitation. It's sort of a similar phenomenon. Instead of being doctors at the clinic, it's architects from McGill and from Université de Montreal en aménagement who come to the Point in Saint-Henri and begin these community organizations, democratically organization, and attack the question of housing. The example in the Point, if my memory serves me, in 1960, half of the units don't have hot water. It's not that all of the units are in terrible shape, but they need to be made into nonprofits because the conditions are not that great, and they need repairs. So this becomes an opportunity. I think also, out of the 60s, that whole notion of community organizing is sort of not necessarily a counterpart, but a sort of the second front to, say, union organizing, which tended to be the left organizing tool. So now the city itself becomes more important. And this also draws on a whole tradition of sort of anarchist local tradition and working with people in neighborhoods, right? So there's that element that is there. Also, one can also look at it from another side, a more macroeconomic point of view. In 1974, it may well be that the federal government institutes changes the National Housing Act to allow for these kinds of funding, because these are not grassroots funded. These are government funded. So between the 70s and the 80s, it didn't last that long, right? The federal government withdraws in 94. 70s to the 80s, it primes the economy. It's the creation of an effective demand, because even though the tenure is nonprofit, all of the economic investments end up in private hands, whether it's architects, whether it's contractors, etc. Right. So from the federal government's point of view and other governments' point of view, that primes the economy. So there's that side of it, and then that's also married with the movements. The same people who to some degree were involved in, say, healthcare movements or clinic movements, and anti-poverty movements and legal rights movements are all sort of the same gang who would be involved in housing. Montreal is also a city of renters, right? At that time, you have 80% of the population is renting. So if you're going to have a social movement around questions of housing in urban, it's going to focus on housing. So I think that's where it comes from. And given my work, I was working in the healthcare sector at that point, but I was working in the neighborhood. And I was working more specifically with people who needed home care. And that was a population that was elderly and had a lot of chronic illnesses. So being in the neighborhood, I was in daily contact with that group of people, a lot of them who lived in rooming houses. Okay. And then when the Milton Park project starts, then I apply for the job, and to some degree I'm well suited because I know the neighborhood, I know the people, and then I end up as the person who helps organize probably and remains probably the largest nonprofit rooming house project in the city.
Okay.
And I was the soutien, I was the resource person and the organizer.
I guess that's what we call grassroots organizing. It's to be in the neighborhood, it's to be with the people who are living on a day-to-day basis these kind of problems, and involving them in the struggle to improve their condition. There was these successes, relative successes, that maybe didn't go as far as some of the more radical activists envisioned. But now, if you look at social movements today, and this has been my experience growing up in the next generation, it seems that our mobilizations are all defensive and about trying to hold on to and not losing things, but we're no longer asking for more services. We're just very defensively trying to defend our droit acquis. How does that affect community organizing? And I don't know, from your experience, what is your take on that?
No, it's a difficult question. I think, without being defeatist or overly pessimistic, one has to see that whole struggle, whether it's here, whether it's in other parts of the world, because that's another thing that is occurring there. The whole question becomes more internationalized. But even if one looks more locally, there was how can one term it? The project did not succeed. I mean, there were certain successes, certain gains, certain things that were done well, and one continues and one builds on them. But there was not that deep-seated radical change that was that was sort of on the agenda and continued to be on the agenda. I think you're right in terms of the defensive side, and one can go back to sort of more macroeconomic phenomena in terms of the waning of sort of the Keynesian welfare state in the Fordist era, and then if one wants to look at it from a more a more kind of socialist Marxist economic side, is that the subsequent contradictions, we won't go into the sort of the details of them, leads to these notions of austerity and cutbacks. And I guess the second one, for getting a little bit technical, the whole financialization of the economy means that entente, that agreement that was in place, which sort of there was a little bit of marge de manœuvre, is no longer there. So one has to fight that that narrowing of possibilities. Going beyond that is I see groups doing that, but one sort of gets in a position of putting a lot of resources into defending what one has and doing the analysis. And groups do not have a hell of a lot of resources anyway. It ain't a fair fight. To quote another friend, Warren Buffett, there is a class war going on, and his gang is winning, right? And I think to some sense that's true.
And saying that, you're saying that there were this. In the beginning of these movements, the end of the 60s or early 70s, there was this kind of excitement, this febrility, this feeling that this is a new day. And that excitement, my impression is that contributed to the success of these projects with the limits and that you're mentioning, but that it was a mobilizing force, and probably is what allowed you to involve the local people, these positive gains. And now, and this is my experience in social movements, we're obligated to mobilize people over the idea of a coming catastrophe. You're talking about ecological crisis, the same thing. And how does that affect the dynamic and the mobilization to have to come to people and say, look, now we're going to lose our housing, maybe we're going to lose our health services over and over again? Does it?
Well, I think one has to nuance that, because I don't think there ever was a golden age.
Okay.
Right? I think that there were sort of both an economic conjuncture and a political conjuncture would give sort of more space, more available space.
Okay.
But it was never a question of a radical wave that was sort of expanding in all directions, etc. There were movements and and there was levels of excitement and then doing things around various projects. In Milton Park, it wasn't 2,000 units, but 536 units, and that was a gain, and people saw it, and there was, we're capable of doing this. Whatever very modest gains that were in place 30 years ago had to be defended then too. It's just sort of more of the same attack side now. One of the realities of sort of being involved in social movements is that one can tend to live in a certain bubble, and you only react within that and not putting it in a larger context. So yeah, it becomes more difficult in a time of restraint and attack. I think the reactions, it depends how the reactions go, and whether there was enough forces of mobilization are there to both talk about maintaining the gains and also expanding where we want to go, because people also can either withdraw. There was never in community groups. I don't think one wants to over romanticize it. And these are one of the contradictions that remain. Is there was also a good dose of professionalization in terms of community organization, right? It's various points, and people did put time into that, being that grassroots, and in certain instances it did work well. In other instances, people substituted themselves for various groups. But and that sort of continues to some degree. But the people fight back. Yeah, people fight back, but it becomes various conjunctures and how much work one does, and sort of to some degree doing the same things and sort of doing it on the street, beginning with people's experiences, whether it's in cutbacks in services in the CLSC. One can take sort of a position more abstractly, or one can work with people who are who are being affected directly by, say, cutbacks there, or say cutbacks in social housing. But nothing's given. If I take the social housing question, there's not a large mobilization around the withdrawal of the federal government. More in Quebec than in Canada, from what I understand, but it is also not a mass mobilization. Okay. What does that say in terms of the sort of long-term mobilization capacities or not of the whole nonprofit sector? I mean, that becomes a whole other discussion of the notion of movements, and how movements can at some points be self-serving and insular and not creative, and not as sort of seedbeds for further action. But those are the contradictions that we all live with.
You mentioned that in these movements there were people who came down from the hill. Sometimes they were Anglophones, sometimes they were Francophone. How did the language issue play into this?
I think overall within social movements, I was involved in social movements, to be clear, more as someone who was to some degree sort of an organizer, but also someone who was sort of put them into practice in terms of the projects themselves. Okay. Say whether say the housing movement, both with community organizations, and at one point after the MCM wins the election and are doing some interesting things in housing in Parapublic, or in living in Verdun in this cultural group Blackrock, which has to do with mostly Anglos. We termed ourselves les maudits blocs. Okay. But that was a show of solidarity, right? In naming ourselves that. But more generally, my sense was there was an agreement came to say with that was arrived at, say within social movements and radical political movements in the 70s, that French was going to be the common language in Quebec as a society, and within social movements and social organizations in Quebec. And I think that agreement occurs, and the one, I'm sure there are other examples, but the one that occurs to me is within the Rassemblement Citoyen de Montréal, the MCM in English, okay. Which is a combination of trade unionists, leftists, sort of out of a tradition, say in the west end of Montreal, the sort of a communist tradition, other elements, say, and some of the people who were involved in, say, coming down the hill, whether it's architecture, sociology, social work, law, sort of all of those combinations. But there was an entente that arrived, which has to do with the whole question of assertion of Québécois, francophone, and then question of national identity and the question of national liberation. So that situation occurs. And I think over the next 30 to 40 years, that is solidified in the sense that and I can sort of look at my experience, say in the early 60s, whether it's in Verdun with the Verdun Anti-Poverty Association, whether it's when I was working on these sort of student government grant programs, or to some degree in the early stages of Milton Park. And Milton Park comes out of that community organizing uptown tradition, with some key people. Kalusha would be an example of that. There is an Anglophone element there. That's part of that Anglophone left element. Mm-hmm. But as we proceed, and I was looking at it, and as we proceed, as the society proceeds, social movements in terms of years, and if I look at just the work that I was doing, more and more I work in a French-speaking environment. Now this is not, I don't think it's untypical. I mean, it's up and down. And then by the time I'm at the community organizer at the CLSC, or at the clinic, or at the technical resource group, 90% of my work is in French. Mm-hmm. It was less so before. So it's clear that this becomes the accepted reality. And I don't think it was among Anglophones with any bitterness or rancor. Here I'm also talking within that bubble of, say, community organizations, right? And I think that's the reality today.
Yes. What motivated Anglo activists or Anglo members of the left to come to that position?
If you're going to take part seriously, and as a serious part of that whole movement, you cannot do it by excluding yourself from 75 to 80% of the population, and you can't do it parallel. It's just not going to work that way. It doesn't make sense, sort of almost logistically and administratively, and it also doesn't make sense in that, this is a society in which 80% of the people communicate in one language, so we'll be part of that society. That doesn't mean that there are not either sort of institutions and traditions and realities that remain, that the inclusion, say, of the Anglophone community, and here again I'm limiting myself to that whole notion of the community movement, the left Anglo gang, becomes of benefit to sort of the larger movement. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Whether it's the sort of the Alinsky, Eric Schrag, that whole notion of a certain type of community organizing, whether it's lately, I was talking to a guy who works with Aeolus, which is the research group here in Montreal. Mm-hmm. And he's a fellow who does a lot of stuff on ecology and energy questions. Mm-hmm. And I have, through the language, I have contacts about, stuff that's going on in English, say in England or the United States, and we exchange information. He says, I didn't know about that. I don't know about that group. So it's sort of, in its best form, it sort of feeds in the Anglo, say, community and sort of radical left can be an interesting source for, contributing and feeding into that kind of reflection. And at the same time, he tells me about a whole series of French researchers and Quebecois researchers that I know some of, but I don't know a lot about. So we exchange it in that sense. So it becomes, fruitful and I've always found that, in a lot of the movements that I work with. Also, as an Anglo, one that ends up being sometimes the the Anglophone service,
Okay.
where
Token.
yeah, well, it's not even talk. Well, it's not even. I don't mind it. If stuff has to be written, especially in the point where there, a lot of as it becomes more francophone in terms of services, there's still a healthy respect for the work that a lot of Anglophones, a lot of Anglophone peoples and residents of the point put into the creation of whether it's the welfare advocacy or co-ops or the clinic where you work, and there's a respect for that, and it remains in terms of information an effort to make it available in English to include people.
Because you mentioned the MCM, that's the
Montreal Citizens Movement.
Citizens Movement. This was a political party that started off in 74.
I don't know, the founding of it was 74, but it sort of has its roots in various other groups. I mean, there's FRAP in 1970, which one of the that's during the FLQ episodes, but it comes out of unions and sort of the Anglo left.
Right.
And it comes out of a whole series of movements that are sort of bubbling up during the 60s and is taking some political shape on an urban scale at that period of time.
Legitimate to say that, because again with all the limits and maybe the divisions, but again, a political party from the left with strong social justice and radical roots that becomes the governing entity in Montreal, that's a kind of a success. Would you say that the fact that in some sense the whole language issue was maybe not put aside but was resolved, and so people were able to come together around a social project, did that contribute significantly to the success?
I think that that's an interesting take on it. There was a lot of support, and it may well have to do, say from the Anglophone side, it may well have to do with the high profile and the kind of respect of people, say at the beginning of the episode, like Michael Feinstadt and Arnold Bennett and Sam Bosky and that whole crowd, and probably drew a lot of support, say in the West End of Montreal. Mm-hmm. So that it becomes important, and in Saint Louis, the area in which we are now, right? So you do get that, and then when you combine that with sort of both the community organization, the tenant organization, and the union base, then you're getting close to a majority of I can't remember what the figures are in terms of turnout in municipal, but then you become a serious contender, and I think one of the serious elements that one could go back and look at what are the who turns out for those kinds of votes. It's also within a context of an autocratic mayor like Maire Drapeau, right, who is not particularly loved, say within the Anglophone community. Yeah, but people have looked at that, but I think that there's it varies, but I think that there's something there where there was a sort of a coming together at that point, and sort of the Anglophone community did play a role there. One thing that I do want to mention, the whole question of Quebec independence and that whole notion, not that it's avoided, but when you're at a municipal level, that doesn't become key. Right. And that has always been my sense within the Anglophone community, whether left or not, less so for the left, that always becomes perhaps a point of rupture as to where people fall. So it's not even coincidentally, if you look at it from that the urban setting is where things get played out, whether it's housing, health, or whatever, then the whole national question can at some points either be not dealt with or avoided to some degree. That the whole notion around Anglophones and the whole question of Quebec independence is probably one that doesn't get addressed in any serious manner.
Okay. You gave me this manifesto, the Blackrock Manifesto, and you mentioned it during our conversation a couple of times, and I see in reading this, the way I see it, this was a manifesto that you wrote with other people in Verdun in 1981. And when I read this, I have a strong feeling of an affirmation, a strong affirmation of Anglo working, or an effort to affirm a kind of Anglophone working class identity. But again, and it's on the same theme, what's interesting in this manifesto, we don't mention language rights or and I'd like you to explain your take on that. What were you trying to do with this manifesto?
Well, just to be clear, the manifesto was essentially written by David Fenario, and the last half is written by Danny Adams, a friend of mine at the time, who's a poet.
Okay.
But we all discussed it.
Okay.
Right? Two things I'd say about that. I think what's interesting about it, in rereading it, it's fairly masculinist. That's one point that I would say about that. One of them. The other one, and it makes me think, because one of the signatories is Martin Bowman. Martin Bowman's from Verdun, as is Scotty Bowman, who was the coach of the Montreal Canadiens. And one of the references in here is to Stan Mikita, who was a hockey player with Chicago Blackhawks, who was not liked by Canadiens fans. And so he would be in an antagonistic relationship with the Canadian fans. And I think it's interesting, just sort of culturally and literarily, that is picked up and then is transmuted into a notion of a working class, Anglo working class, saying, no, fuck you. So I think, it reminds me of sort of Raymond Williams and the notion of history and literature from below, where you take your daily experience, and here it has to be in sports, and then you transmute it. People are going to pick up on it because they know who Stan Mikita is, but then you transmit it into political, social terms.
But who are you saying?
That's it.
Who are you saying fuck you to? You
saying fuck you to
Francophones?
no. Saying fuck you to. I mean that's the to a system that is oppressive to the Anglophones and that is oppressive to the Francophones. And I think the language question here, and David does talk about it, and Danny does talk about it, and this has been a theme for David, I think, throughout his plays. The language question is clear, that the Anglophone community gets used
by the elite,
by the Anglo elite. Yeah. So I think that's where that language, and it's not and Anglophones end up, and I'm hoping it's changed somewhat. A lot of Anglophones that I grew up with ended up not speaking French and working in institutions, whether it's the Douglas Hospital, the General, McGill, Concordia, where you didn't need to speak French. From my side, fortunately, from when I'm 15, I'm working with children in the park in Verdun, and I learned to speak French. That's one of my entries into the whole world that I've been talking about. I'm able to speak French from the age of 16. So I'm able to sort of operate in that world. And I'm hoping, there's a resistance, and the resistance gets complicated, and it gets involved in certain prejudices and racism, which happen within the Anglophone community. But I'm hoping now, when I look at the school systems, at least Protestant school, or whatever, I believe that most Protestant, I'm dating myself, right? English-speaking schools, they are now offering, they are either immersion in French or bilingual. So I'm hoping all of those children will come out being able to converse in French easily. And I think that would be, whatever happens, and especially say for social movements, whatever, that will further reinforce that agreement that I'm sort of dating back to the early 70s. There's a tradition, there's an Anglo tradition in Quebec, but in overall terms, in terms of this society, for various reasons, the public discussion, the political discussion, the community discussion, the left discussion will occur in French. That's the deal. Doesn't mean that we're not going to, David's not going to continue to write. He's going to continue to write, and then there's some parts of it which are more bilingual than not, and whatever. But he's also, that's also the reality that I think has to be promoted and cherished too.
Having lived through 3 or 4 decades of social movements and social change, whether for the better or the worse, what kind of advice do you have to offer younger activists today?
It's an odd position to be in, in terms of advice.
Yeah.
I guess what I have learned, and it's sort of been a little bit of a theme here, and it's something that's been in, I've been concerned with and reflecting upon seriously for the past couple of years, more in a more concentrated manner, and that's the notion in terms of radical popular education. It's not to tell people what to do. It's not to tell people that you're getting screwed over, et cetera, et cetera. It's to be with people and respect people's experiences, and also to also understand that popular education has to do with yourself as an organizer. You have to be deschooled, and you have to sort of rethink what you're doing. And the relationship is not one of convincing anyone of anything. It's to be in a respectful dialogue where both people are both teachers and learners at the same time. So I think that's one aspect. That's more in terms of the approach. Instead, sort of getting away of and being very conscious, and a lot of people in community organizations and movements are being very conscious of that kind of professionalization and that sort of hiving off of the expertise. On the other hand, that doesn't mean that you don't look at the past and you don't do a serious analysis of what happened and what were the pitfalls and what were the difficulties, and looking at how it happens in your neighborhood, how it happens in your city, how it happens in the nation state you happen to live in, and critiques of all of that, not getting lost in it, but being sort of aware of it, so one doesn't get trapped. One doesn't also want to be trapped by the sort of the day-to-day operationalization of it. You want to be able to keep attention in terms of what you're doing on a daily basis, and also looking at it in its sort of larger, its larger social and political and economic context. Our society, in fact, the world society, is faced with a series of very important crises that are worldwide in nature. Whether it's around notions of social justice, an economic crisis, just in terms of where the economic system of capitalism is at the moment, and also an ecological crisis with multiple dimensions to it. And I think that has to be taken into account in the sense, if we're going to do, I'll take the example, if we're going to do nonprofit social housing, let's make it zero carbon. And in fact, let's make it so that it can be much more locally energy based, and that it becomes a question of urban agriculture, but not folding in on itself. That becoming part of a larger movement, let's take the example in Quebec, of being tied to, say, the stopping the pipelines. It has to be even more so than before, that those have to be interlinked and interlocked. I think there's a sort of a change of scale here when we are talking about ecological crises, and change of scale also in terms of time. We probably have 15 to 20 years to really make a difference in terms of these large-scale ecological crises. So that's a real, that in terms of people who are going to be living after me, I think, and people are involved in it. And it's great to see students, that becomes one of their focuses. But then it also becomes, how does one create, and it's always been the question, how does one create a mass mobilized movement around those questions? And I think that's, obviously, I'm not saying anything particularly new, that's one of the key issues that I think that younger activists have to deal with.